And we're live, and welcome back, everyone. This is Joe Saundry, president of NSMA, and when I'm not doing NSMA things, I'm operating some corporation called Thought Delivery Systems, which also has James McPherson and Mariana Archibald and others who work there. Mariana is also an environmental engineer and very accomplished in sustainable environments. And she'll be listening rapidly, and we'll have a little chitty chat at the back end of this presentation. There's 145 slides here. I'm not going to expose you guys 145 slides because I value my life. So I'm going to expose you to maybe 10 slides and then pop into a couple others, and then we'll have a discussion. But what we're going to do is talk about, in the structure of a top 10 list, some of the issues around what is happening in RF interference world. Harvey just walked through a lot of that, and a lot of our previous speakers today, Brian Tremont, we had Mitchell talk earlier, we had George and JD talk, and everyone at one level or another, everyone's talked about some edge pressing in our industry, pressing into a greater need to measure RF interference and in new ways. So we're going to talk a bit about that. And some of this means talking about things outside of our realm, like how do you structure an understanding of the environment? So an environmental engineer knows how to do that, how to talk about buildings from a more holistic standpoint, or about sustainable land use or whatever. And because our industry is poking into all those areas, and the only way to measure our industry is really through, an NSMA type group. That's why the FCC created us back in 1984, is to be an interface on RF measurement with not only the FCC itself, but other federal agencies, and of course with industry. So with that, I'll start popping through the slides in the top 10 list of issues. And then on the back end of that, we'll have a little conversation with Mariana, and of course any questions from the group. And then at 2:30, we'll jump to another panel, Electromagnetic Effects on Spectrum Management, with Mark Johnson of the Navy. So without further ado, so our overview today is to new ways to look at traditionally unstudied or understudied interference using standard spectrum management methods. And, what does that mean? That could mean a lot of things, and that's why I have 145 slides, and I'm not going to show you all of them, but, we're not going to take it to the extreme. So we're going to just look at a top 10 list of some of the issues that are out there, very prominent. Some not so prominent, but most are pretty prominent now. And once we go through that documentation, we'll start looking at it through a environmental engineer's lens. So the top 10 list. So one is the standard RF interference methodology. We're all pretty well aware of that as spectrum managers or members of NSMA, but I just want to level set on that in a moment. Then how do we take that standard RF interference methodology and examine RF from and into non-traditional sources? We traditionally didn't have satellite mega constellations to worry about, like Harvey just mentioned, for example. We now do. We didn't traditionally have so many, in terms of a teledensity standpoint, so many antennas everywhere. And as discussed in the human RF interference discussion, the FCC is more and more concerned about that, and we have more and more tools that are coming available. But that's there's some extrapolations there that we'll get into in a moment. RF is optical, so Harvey again talked about that, and we talked about that earlier in terms of everything from light pollution to pollution to sensitive instruments. There's also a whole nother methodology at a very personal level. Optical level measurements. There's a series of AMA and in the medical community ways to study the impact of RF on your eyes. And as we're going up in bands, and we're having more and more RF transmissions in more and more different bands, how do we measure to make sure we're continuing to be safe? And the FCC, which it readily constantly acknowledges, is not a healthcare agency, and so other agencies are going to start looking at this more closely. And how do we think about it, and let them know that when they're studying a human or a natural RF phenomena, can they reasonably take that, whatever they're studying, and translate it back to a source. Because then people start pointing fingers like, I know we have a tower in your backyard, but we're not the source. It's some other source. It's the sun or whatever. How do you discern that? And that's discerned really through science, right? It's through spectrum management. And we've all been aware at the ITU for decades. I spent, in the 1990s and the early 2000s, and including up to a couple of years ago, a lot of time at the ITU, where everyone gets really detailed and really focused on when is interference occurring into a system or a device, or from a system or a device into another system or device. And we're going to talk a bit about that. And we're going to have to start thinking about expanding that in other realms like optical. And then we're going to talk about structural. And structural is buildings, towers, indoor, outdoor, residential, commercial, industrial, agricultural, special use structures, things like that. And then federal agencies. Andy asked a question on the last panel. How do you start looking at some of these broader issues? And one area is, and we raised this earlier yesterday with the OET folks. What about MOUs? And we talked about this a little bit earlier today as well. MOUs not just between the FCC and NTIA, but MOUs between, let's say, the FCC and FDA and EPA and maybe Homeland Security Department and for cyber and all these other issues that are coming up, because a lot of these issues are literally riding on RF. And then we'll talk about weather as a top 10 list, legal issues, and be a bit more of an update on some legal matters that are happening, and then minerals and other elements, which is very interesting. And then just, the fact is, no top 10 list. We're all human. And no top 10 list can be complete if we don't just say there's other issues out there, because there's always other issues out there. So without further ado, moving into standard RF methodologies and characteristics. So there's a few ways to look at this, and we can quibble. We could look at TIA or IEEE or some of our own guidelines, but here's one standard way to look at characteristics of interference. I won't go through it in detail. But we're all aware that there's different sharing studies and compatibility studies and how to characterize emissions, and who is emitting, who is receiving, and what are the standards that they should be complying with, what should be future standards. And at the ITU, there's ITUF 758. There's other recommendations, the F series and the SF series, that get into a lot of detail about that. And so the point is, which we'll go into later, is we should start thinking about applying this to other realms, whether it's radio astronomy or it's human health, as a matter of biology and science. And I'll go to the next slide. Again, this slide talks about considerations on allowable performance and availability and degradations due to interference and related interference criteria. But what we're hearing from are other constituencies, powerful ones in healthcare and other sciences in other areas. They're saying that they're concerned, or they're perceiving harm from RF. Well, being concerned or having maybe an emotional reaction to a new element doesn't mean that you're actually getting interference from that. We know that our science, the science of spectrum management, is about really breaking things down to, well, what is the allowable performance from the system? What is, if you're concerned about a system that we don't traditionally study, how do we start measuring that system that we don't traditionally study? So as human beings, we have, like all living things, this is biology 101, we all have an electrical signal. If something has an electrical signal, it's alive. Anything on this list, once it has an electrical signal, it's alive. And when it stops having an electrical signal, it's dead. It's inert. It's no different in many respects to, a rock or ashes or a piece of non-biologically active dirt. So now that seems a bit out there, but if you talk to senior biologists and you get into the weeds of this, it goes back to a simple principle. We learned this in biology 101. If you're alive, you have an electrical signal. If you have an electrical signal, you are transmitting and receiving at some level. And so what we've been doing at Thought Delivery Systems is looking into, with more sensitive and more sensitive instrumentation, literally what channels do humans operate on? So I'm going to repeat that because a lot of people have a hard time even contemplating what I'm talking about. We operate on different channels. If I turn around and put books on my shelf and somebody walks into my study and they're upset with me and I don't hear them, I still feel them. That's a intuitive way we all understand that somebody's radiating energy at us and we're receiving it, right? Those are two biological systems radiating information. You can measure that. So I'm going to repeat that. You can measure that. You can measure how people interact, not just visually, not just orally, not just through touching somebody, but through electrical signals. So what I'm arguing is that we should start applying that very measurable signal to the confines of our discipline. The confines of our discipline are measuring, exactly what channels we operate on. What's the noise floor when we can perceive, or our cells can perceive energy incoming, as well as what type of energy can sophisticated instrumentation perceive coming off from us. So again, that sounds a little wild, but believe it or not, it's very measurable. And there's plenty of examples out there. There's a lot of empirical data and more that's coming. I'll click ahead through some of that when it comes to butterflies and bees and whales and sharks. This month on the cover of National Geographic, there's a series of very world-class scientists who validated that sharks, for example, navigate using magnetite and other minerals inside of them back to very precise locations. And we all know that butterflies and other living beings go back to very precise locations. And how do they do that? And what interferes with that? That's the question. Is there something that interferes with that? Are we doing anything that interferes with that? And even if we are, does it matter? And should we be altering our networks or not? Those questions are being asked. We should get out ahead of those questions, and have some sort of, as a discipline, a way of assessing that, so we don't get surprised later and told we have to shut off all our networks because of the butterfly migration next month or whatever. We need to understand that ahead of time, so we're not surprised. That's at least what I'm advocating. And here's one of the examples of an RF electromagnetic field study from cell phone towers on biosystems. And some of these are very, very well peer reviewed. Some of these I look at and could use more peer review. But in terms of having a systemology and a discipline for assessing this, it's kind of past time for the industry to get more involved in that. And as we'll discuss later, other federal agencies are getting more and more interested in this. So the more we're ahead of this, the more we're thought leaders, the more we're going to be ready to play catch. You don't want to be facing the other direction when somebody throws you a football, otherwise you get hit in the head. In terms of RF as optical, I won't spend a lot of time on that because Harvey just did a world-class look at some of that on light pollution and also optical in terms of astronomers. So I'll save us all a lot of time on that. In terms of structural, residential, commercial, industrial, agricultural, and specialty, and this will be a part of the discussion with Mariana later. Building materials, building designs. Today, when you get a construction permit, and JD talked about this in the Human RF panel with George and I, we're more and more as a species, we're taking networks and pushing signal into buildings, for example, but we never really design a building to, it's never a primary consideration to understand the RF environment of the materials of the design. We're not purposely designing a building so it'll be easier for RF signals to get in and out without having to power up a huge, bank of 5G transmitters on multiple poles outside the walls, because the walls were designed in a manner to be too obtuse or too reflective or too impermeable to RF transmission. And of course, there's some real world needs, as was mentioned by JD earlier, and we've been talking about this at length. You can't even get a building permit by law. In theory, and now in practice in some states, you cannot get a building permit of occupancy, a certificate of occupancy, unless you can prove you have the ability for the 911 signal, the ambulance, the police and fire, in each and every corner of that building. Now, that's a federal law. Is it enforced? Not as much as it could be. It's being pretty well enforced very somewhat recently in Ohio and Florida. Other states, not so much. But again, this is a growing trend. This is not a decreasing trend. This is only a growing trend. So you've got that going on. So buildings need to be, in terms of their design and materials for RF permeability, they need to be, you don't want to build a building and then not get your certificate of occupancy and have to wait to redesign your whole building after you spend $100 million in a huge office tower, or a big corporate campus, or even your dream cabin, whatever it is. You don't want to have that problem, right? So that's one part of it for the 911 and emergency signaling. The other part of it is, and we'll get into this more later, there's a lot of people who are sensitives, who are documented as being very sensitive to RF. So they're going to want to do this from their own, in their viewpoint, their own self-preservation or their own personal health. And there's a growing list of doctors who say this subset of people who are sensitives do want to be living in an RF quiet zone type of environment. And we can talk more about this. This also applies to agriculture. It applies to the natural world. We have no clue how RF impacts mitochondria in the soil, or certain birds, or the lettuce we eat. When we order a Big Mac with lettuce and tomato, we have no idea scientifically, and we're getting to a point in our development as a species that we should understand that. And ideally, none of this has a material impact, and great, and then we can prove it. But if it does have a material or a potentially material impact, we should start hearing from USDA, FDA, EPA, Homeland Security, and all that. This stuff is starting to be studied more and more. And again, our discipline as spectrum managers is directly tied to it. Because if we let people start designing for, let's say, a building occupancy certificate, their own studies, and they don't meet, going back to that ITU criteria I shared at the top of the discussion, if they don't follow that, or some reasonably disciplined and accepted RF interference and RF assessment tool and criteria and baseline, then their whole study will be, even if it's well funded, won't really fit anyone's understanding of the source of energy and the impact from that source, right? That's what we do for a living. And so it's time to start arguing a little more strenuously to folks who are going to be holding up building occupancy permits because of RF. Make sure that they're following some sort of standard criteria, so our networks can continue to operate and be permitted, and so those buildings can continue to be occupied. And again, this is a growing issue. If we go like this and hide ourselves from this issue, it's not going away. Not going away. So it's time to start thinking about this in a much broader sense. And the structural matters are, whether it's farms or residences or office towers or industrial parks or a specialty area where people are making chips. We do know when people make chips at Qualcomm or wherever else, they're in a very shielded environment. They know enough to do that. But are we applying that type of instrumentation to something else that might be really sensitive, maybe in making of pharmaceuticals or in the making of, who knows what. But let other groups start looking at this a little bit more intensively. When it comes to sustainable land use, there's a big push right now for and massive funding for reforestation. There's something called the Trillion Tree Act that was passed. The Trillion Tree Act. It's a lot of trees. I'm on the board of something called the Archangel Ancient Tree Archive, where we go around the planet and we get the world's oldest and largest trees. We find them. We get legal rights to climb them and take fresh cuttings from them, and then make 100% lineage copies of them, and then reforest with them. So in that, using that, that's again going back to living things. Those are living things. They have their own RF signature. They have their own criteria for. You can't just plant huge coast redwoods in the Sahara and hope they're going to grow. So there's practical issues around them, standard practical issues that you think about planting any garden. But then there's other issues overlaying now about, is there an RF issue or quotient there or not? And that's being studied. because trees, and I mentioned this back in 2019 when I did the last presentation, there's a whole bunch of peer-reviewed information that trees are antennas. And of course, we also mentioned this back in 2019, trees, and we all know this, trees also, in terms of foliage and everything else, block signal or degrade signal. And so there's a whole area around trees. And if we're going to be reforesting the planet, at the same time, people need to get RF through to their customers. Those are inherently in some sort of conflict unless we start thinking about it more carefully. And Tom Brockader's, it wasn't a coincidence that he was showing how a drone could get past a particular tree, 10 or 15 kilometers away. It was a tree. It wasn't, and so, that is an inherent element that's not going away. We're planting more trees. We're building more networks. Do we have a better understanding of those trees and those as they interrelate with the networks we're trying to build? And that all is a subset of sustainable land use. There are people out there who are global experts on sustainable land use, John D. Liu, Mark Shepard, and a variety of others, and a lot of schools on this at Yale and others that are talking about this more and more. And the RF element is starting to creep in for using RF in terms of networks to help people reforest. A lot more people want to live out among forests. There's a Yale study, a meta-study that came out, a meta-study being a study of studies. Nearly 1,000 peer-reviewed studies were examined. And if you live or work among healthy forests and meadows, you live 12% longer. So I'll repeat that. If you live or work among healthy meadows, old growth forests and meadows, you live 12% longer. So there's a motivation to be in those environments. And if you're in that environment, there's a motivation to be connected to the internet and to communications. So again, these vectors are converging more and more and more. And again, spectrum managers are in the center of that. And again, that's a whole line of discipline of information we could talk through it in more length. In terms of federal agencies of expertise, each federal agency has an underlying statute and mission. And the EPA has a very specific mission, and more what the FCC is approving may or may not be encroaching on the EPA's mission, or the EPA may be doing something and making a conclusion about RF signaling, or because we talked about NEPA, right? Environmental assessments. They're already the foundation stone for the human RF exposure requirements and guidelines that the FCC published Friday, less than a week ago. So the EPA is well involved. But before the EPA starts making more and more conclusions, for example, should it understand in some detail, and should it have some sort of emissary to the FCC on how to assess RF, right? And is the FCC properly resourced for that? Does the FCC have enough engineers for that? Does the FCC have an interest in guidelines from NSMA on that, as well as EPA? Is there any MOU being considered between the EPA and the FCC, memorandum of understanding? And as we talked about earlier today, there's an MOU, 17 years old and needing updating between the FCC and NTIA on how to share spectrum. But another federal agency of expertise, which is directly involved in our line of business, with human RF exposure requirements and NEPA, which we discussed at length earlier today. Do we need an MOU with them to understand, so they don't inadvertently do something that upsets our industry, or we don't inadvertently do something that upsets rulemaking or something that's in their core statutory mission? And this applies to cybersecurity with DHS. This applies to probably Space Command with satellite mega constellations, potentially. Who's looking at this? Is this being thought through? This applies to FDA and medical devices and things we talked about earlier today. And we'll get into more detail on that in a moment. GAO. So the GAO reviews all federal agencies, and they pretty clearly stated not too long ago that exposure and tracking and testing requirements for like mobile phones should be reassessed. So this is the Government Accounting Office. If the OMB, which is all the federal agencies' boss, all the federal agencies are measured or managed as a legal structure through the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. If OMB issues a circular on some of this without consultation with spectrum managers, that could be an issue, right? It could impact us or our clients or whomever. So again, this is all coming up more and more to a fore with all the federal agencies and what they do, and we should be thinking about this in much more detail. Weather, we could get into not only what Harvey was talking about, but in terms of NOAA satellites, in terms of not only the satellite mega constellations that may or may not be impacting them, but what else should the sensors on board those satellites be measuring in confluence with what we're talking about? Should there be other measurements occurring, or should there be spectrum analyzers up there that are reporting back to our networks? Maybe the government has those in the military or other sectors, but should there be spectrum analyzers up there where you get a daily spectrum report, much like you get a daily weather report? Things like that, the big picture ideas. I believe in Israel, they're starting to put more RF sensors permanently on buildings, going back to the building issue. But if we start thinking as RF, solar flares naturally occurring to man-made, bursting and during a storm on satellite, on whether it's a satellite network or a terrestrial network, that type of measurement, should that become more and more something that's more standard, much like weather? And there's a variety of other aspects to that. Legal. So I'm going to pop through a bunch of legal and then minerals and a couple of other elements before I get to the much more detail on legal. This I'm looking through is all the periodic elements, periodic table elements. And there doesn't seem to be, as far as I'm aware, an overlay of the periodic table and how RF interacts with each and every one of these elements, right? But it would be interesting to have an understanding of that, going back to the building materials, going back to the way a lot of people are making more and more RF active clothing. Some people want RF sensors on their clothing or in their smartphones and their yoga pants and things like that. And understanding whether it's clothing, building materials, furniture, cars, medicines we ingest, go down the list. They all break down ultimately to these elements. These are all the core structures. So how do these interact with RF? Do we even know as a species? Maybe it's time we have a study to do that, much like the Human Genome Project. Other issues, that'll be for discussions. I'm going to click through. This is a set of 5G concerns. Some of these are more, I don't want to say alarmist, but they're more worried about human RF exposure from mobile. But there's a lot of core scientists there. I think we should start listening to these more carefully and getting more ahead of these and understanding how they fit inside the recent developments at the FCC and other agencies. These are, for lack of a better term, more mainstream journalists talking to more mainstream scientists at places like Johns Hopkins and Cal Berkeley and places like that. So, it's time to start paying attention to folks like this a little bit more and understand what their concerns are, and then make sure they're getting involved in understanding the discipline of how to measure properly what is actual interference and the source of interference using professional methods, professional spectrum management methods. I'm going to pop through a few slides. This is a whole thing about NOAA and weather satellites and 5G weather forecasts. The head of NOAA has some concerns going back to that discussion. There's issues on, it was discussed about China and the impact of, we talked about this in the satellite mega constellation. Yeah, we also can't be worried about everything and hold everything back and be overtaken by China, for example. That's not a good thing. We can't be navel gazers either. There's a real politic and a real understanding of what is a realistic way to look at this and what are realistic timeframes. I'm going to get into a couple of the legal slides in a little bit, but the 5G effects on are not just being worried about here in the U.S. They're being worried about in France and their federal agencies and at the ITU more and more. So again, I just wanted to lay out that it's not just the U.S. federal agencies; it's the other developed countries' federal agencies as well. In terms of the, I think I'm gonna. I'm looking at the time. It's 2:26, so I'm gonna pull out of this program in terms of the slides and pop in with Mariana if she's available. There she is. Hey there, Mariana.
Hi. Well, for those of you watching, you probably have gathered that my background is not in spectrum management, but Joe and I decided that it would be a nice change of pace to get kind of an outsider's perspective on some of these issues, to just ask some questions that maybe aren't being asked because we assume everybody knows, but also kind of get an understanding of what someone who's not in the field is thinking about some of these things and what the perspective is.
Yeah.
So, Joe, unless you want to put me in the hot spot, I have a couple of questions for you after hearing.
Yeah, go for it. Go for it. I'll go for it.
Y'all, this is not rehearsed. You're getting live. I wanted to start with something that Harvey List said in his presentation a few minutes ago that really struck me, and I feel like is also part of the overall conversation that you were touching on. I'm going to paraphrase Harvey. So he said that indifferent radio spectrum managers have become the gatekeepers of the optical appearance of the night sky. And it really made me think of who is really the gatekeeper of protecting the environment when it comes to some of these things. And as I've done some research in the past, you really get the whole, both sides of the spectrum in terms of opinions on this. Here's the spectrum joke. But you really do see the both sides. And I tend to always fall somewhere in the middle because I feel as though there's, in many cases, truth to both sides, right? So I've also heard you talk so much about measuring twice and cutting once. And I'd love to get your personal opinion of that when it comes to advances in transmission technology and whether or not they are occurring in a way that also takes the environment into consideration. And I heard you mention a couple of times the reality is that we're not really sure as a scientific community what all the ramifications are. So what tools do we have out there to measure accurately? You said measuring properly using professional methods. So I'd love to hear from your professional opinion how that is happening when it comes to advances in transmission technology.
Great. Well, thanks for that question. It's definitely at the core. And there's three things going on. One is I've been involved with the formation of a group called the Balance Group, where we're trying to be extremely center line, straight across the plate on getting the best in class folks who understand these issues on a measurement level and on a issue spotting level. So one, we're trying to get the best in class folks and open up our ears so we don't have indifferent, whether they're spectrum allocators or managers or network builders, but folks who are best in class in all these fields I was talking about. Two, there is a new term called supra-constitutional, when a agency or a large scale operator acts in a manner because they weren't given any guidance, where they actually are trampling on maybe the rights of the Homeland Security Department or the rights of the FDA. So that sort of begs the question, is anyone really in charge? And in a vacuum, folks make decisions, right? So we need a bigger rethink, is what we're being told, a bigger rethink of what we're doing when we're building massive, let's say, mega constellations that are impacting the missions, the core missions of multiple federal agencies in multiple countries, and we just approve them through one agency, or we just let one entrepreneur or two entrepreneurs just go at it, and we'll worry about it later. We'll iterate through it. Maybe that's not the best way to do it. So and then how do you measure it? It is spectrum analyzers for one. It is asking scientists to study everything from optical nerves to astronomy, both in the micro and the macro microscope looks at at these issues. So hopefully that's a relatively broad enough answer for you. If it isn't, hit me.
Well, and do you feel as though all of that is happening currently in the industry? Are people collaborating in a way where these technological advances are occurring with all these things that you just described in mind?
Great question. So they're happening organically at the grassroots level, like with the formation of the Balance Group, with the discussions at NSMA, this year. This has popped up in I can't even count, 5 or 6 different, this issue has popped up in 5 or 6 different panels and presentations, at least 5 or 6. So we're inherently a natural collecting pool for these issues. The FCC itself and other federal agencies that are naturally collecting pools, are they properly resourced? Have they been given the money and the engineers and the other professionals they need and the equipment they need to do this? And also, as the industry that makes equipment, you can't, in business, it's really hard to do anything. If you can't measure it, you don't know how to make a decision for it. So, being able to measure what people are concerned about. So like these spectrum analyzers, and Tom Brockader showing a new way to use spectrum analyzers, having the folks from Anritsu and other corporations showing us what type of spectrum analyzers they have. So at least we can take a calibrated instrumentation administered by a licensed spectrum manager. We heard this from Inarte, how you get a certified spectrum manager operating it, and going through your motions, going through your criteria, so you can come back with a professional grade output. Going back to lawsuits, there was a lawsuit denied in Arizona and New Mexico this year, and the judge told folks who were concerned about RF emissions, you have a lot of doctors and a lot of folks who have serious medical conditions, but you didn't reasonably tether it back to a source. Yes, you're pointing at towers and things in your neighborhood, but you didn't do any analysis, right? And of course, the folks who are being pointed at they don't want to be pointed at if they're following FCC standards, right? This could be somebody's, going back to George's analysis, maybe it could be somebody's Christmas tree that caused the problem. If the problem is even tethered to an RF issue, it could be a host of other issues in the environment, or COVID, or a reaction to a pharmaceutical, or who knows what. So tethering things back and measuring them using the best in class methodologies we have, is the recommendation. And the more we muscle up on that, I think the better off we're all going to be. So
I have one more question right now that comes to mind, and I've noticed that Harvey posted a comment. From the research that I've done, and this may be quite 101 for the audience, I've learned a lot the last couple of days about spectrum management, but one of the things that George Kaiser was talking about was point-to-point transmission, as opposed to omnidirectional transmission. And in the context of 5G, what percentage, if are you seeing as omnidirectional versus point-to-point? Is it something that we should be concerned about? And do you feel as though the rollout of these new transmission technologies are happening in a way that's responsible? And is there a better way to do it?
Yeah, great question. So there's 3 things going on. We heard this at one level from Brian Tremont. There's a massive amount of infrastructure funds for broadband builds coming out. I do know, I studied and was heavily involved with the RDOF, the Rural Development Opportunity Fund, which is $20.4 billion, and $9.2 billion that was handed out in December. And I know some of the folks who are the main awardees and have been consulting with them. A lot of that's going to fiber. So in that sense, fiber might have other issues, but then you're going to have less RF issues with that. However, going back to your core question, is there more fixed wireless being deployed than, let's say, Omni or sectored transmissions? No, it's a massive increase. It's a great question. It's a massive increase in wide area coverage. So it's an exponential increase. I don't know if we have even measured it as an industry, but we do know that there's more and more folks want to have more and more 5G networks everywhere. We have more and more satellite mega constellations being deployed. We have more and more needs for first responder networks that are 5G-like capable, and that's all sector or omnidirectional in scope. Now, to be sure, a lot of them will have in their backbones some fixed wireless, which is demonstrably, much less of a radiator, as George so aptly shown, demonstrably so. And maybe we need to be doing more of that and less of the omnidirectional wherever we can. It might be the ultimate analysis, more fiber, more fixed wireless, less omnidirectional, where folks have a legitimate concern or they want to pay for less omnidirectional. Some people, the economy will, the hidden hand of Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, the market might come back with a solution. At the same time, the regulators, more and more of them are being asked to look at this, and they may on their own make their own decisions. And obviously, we'd rather have them make informed decisions given professional grade RF analyses from the spectrum management community. And Harvey has a question there. So.
Yes, Harvey wrote, Viasat's recent FCC filing pointing out the FCC's exemption of satellites from NEPA concerns struck a chord with astronomers, both optical and radio.
Yeah, great point from Harvey. And the Balance Group had a similar filing. And as you, many of you know who were on the NSMA Online yesterday, we had Viasat's Chief Officer for Global Regulatory Affairs, John Janka, speaking to some of those issues along with Trey Hambury, who's also a highly recognized attorney in the satellite space. So yeah, thank you for that comment, Harvey. And yeah, that's true. And recommend folks read Viasat's comments for sure.
So to sum it up, Joe, do you think that us, let's call myself a civilian outside of the industry, do you think we're overreacting to the possible harmful effects of 5G, or do you think there's some truth to it? Where do you, in your personal opinion, where do you think it falls on that?
I'm, I tend to weather a lot of the more, I don't know if emotional is the right word, but more alarmed concerns. I weather them, but I also tend to, sometimes where there's smoke, there's fire. And if there's a concern, ignoring it is not the way to go. Measuring it and assessing it is the way to go. And where there's legitimate concerns, they should be dealt with for sure. And we also don't want our federal agencies to be stampeded if there's a legitimate concern out there, if they don't measure it the right way. And we get a regulation imposed on us without our input, that's not a good look for us. So to me, it's measure, get more involved, get ahead of it, more dialogue. And I guess we have a comment from Leo Serbo, an electrical engineer at the FCC.
Yes, he writes, occasionally people complain about experiencing effects from RF. These people tend to get passed around to different agencies. Maybe they truly are sensitive to normal RF conditions. Is there anyone studying these cases? Likely are other issues.
That's a fantastic point from Leo. Yeah, so the short answer is yeah, the Balance Group is studying these. There's a team, different teams of physicians studying these. There's a group called the Environmental Health Trust, another group called Children's Health Defense, and recently another way to study, and this is where we get into the more sharper elbowed world. There's a class action attorney who filed in Louisiana, and I'll post the link in the PowerPoint. He filed it, I think, last week, a class action suit where he said his clients, he believed, were harmed by RF. So, then we'll have our federal judiciary looking at these issues and assessing the viability of those claims. So that's another type of measurement, the legal measurement system where all kinds of subject matters are brought in and the assessment is made through that. And of course, there's the other case going on. I mentioned it earlier today in the human RF exposure discussion. There's a case in the federal court here in DC by Environmental Health Trust et al. Against the FCC on these very human RF exposure rules. They want them to be stricter. So those are two cases, and there's at least a half dozen others, as well as, again, we're trying to do this scientifically and get out ahead of it. Great question from Leo Serbo. Appreciate it. I guess
Yeah, I know we're running a little bit over. I wanted to end by saying thanks to everyone for having me, having, this experience of seeing firsthand how many amazing and brilliant people in the industry that are actually taking a long, hard look at this has been eye-opening and great. And I've been learning so much. So thanks for letting an outsider in. And I've loved meeting everyone and all the discussions. So, and Joe, thanks for having me here in the hot seat.
You got it. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mariana. I appreciate your willingness to jump in with a bunch of Spectrum managers, for crying out loud. That's like swimming with crocodiles. So thank you.
Y'all are great.
And next we have Mark Johnson on electromagnetic effects on spectrum management. And then after that, we'll literally close the conference and we'll have a board meeting with the NSMA board members. Thank you so much, Mariana.
Thank you.
All right.